Up from the underground, the rise of alternative rock. That's what we're going to talk about next in this episode of Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. Hello and welcome to Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. I'm your host, Ian C. This is a show today that I've actually wanted to talk about for a while now, and I wanted it to be one of those foundational shows which I address this issue of the rise of alternative rock. Again, I'm sure you might get tired of me saying this, but I feel like I need to repeat this. This show, Some Cereal for Dinner, is all about growing up Generation X and the music and the films and the television shows and the games and the whatever that influenced us as we were coming up, mostly about then and a little bit about now. And one of those things I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about would be alternative rock and the rise of alternative rock and the origins of alternative rock, and then my introduction to it and how I kind of switched over from kind of being this heavy metal headbanger, glam metal enthusiast to an alternative rock person. We're going to get all into that today. The thoughts might be a little bit scrambled, but I have a lot of them on this subject. And like I said, this is not necessarily a show about music per se, but music was a big influence to me growing up Generation X, and I think by extension a big influence on those people who would be interested in a podcast like this. And previously I talked about the rise and fall of hair metal, and then I talked about underground music as well on a previous podcast. Now we're going to talk about the rise of that underground music to the forefront, to its kind of takeover in popularity in the popular culture, and what happened there. What was it, and how I connected to it. So we're going to do a little bit of history of alternative rock and my own personal story, journey to alternative rock, and my experience with the rising of alternative rock, because I was there for that. A lot of what affected me growing up Generation X happened, my early years were like late 70s, 80s, and then, into the late 80s. This is going to take us up into the late 80s and the early 90s and mid 90s, which was all still part of my growing up years. I think in about 92, I was around 18 years old, as I recall. I think it would have been just right around 18. So I came of age, and in 91, Nirvana broke out and kind of broke that underground scene. But I came of age right when that was happening, and it kind of changed my life. And I saw the development of it, and I was there during the development of alternative rock. So let's break this down. Let's talk about it. Let's talk first of all about what is alternative rock and why they called it alternative rock. And the other thing I want to talk about is what are the earliest alternative rock bands, and then some of the bands that came later, and why it broke the scene, and how grunge was a particular part, a major part of that movement, but it wasn't the only part of that movement. So I want to talk about all those things today. So let me start with a quick and brief definition. What is alternative rock? Well, the very definition of alternative rock was the fact that it didn't fit into other categories. You started having a handful of bands in probably, I would say, it's hard to know when exactly to pin it, but of course the early 80s, and then of course by the mid 80s, you had a handful of bands that really didn't fit into any category. And that's why that's the origin of the name alternative. It was certainly rock music, but it wasn't classic rock, although there were elements in some of the bands. And it wasn't punk rock, although some of these bands were punk or had punk roots. It wasn't pop rock, although some of the bands in this movement had very pop sounds to them. And it wasn't heavy metal, although some of the bands, albeit fewer, the bands didn't, had some of that to it, had some elements of that to it. And it wasn't new wave, although again, there were some bands who had some new wave influence in what they did. So what was interesting about this early conglomeration of what we call alternative rock is it varied in it couldn't be identified with any one particular type of previously established rock music. But it varied in how much it borrowed from other music. So there might be one alternative band who borrowed heavily from punk and heavily from pop, and it would be considered alternative. But there would be other bands that would not have as much punk, but they would draw more from new wave and maybe even some heavy metal influences and some classic rock influences, but really not have a punk flavor at all to it. And so that would be an alternative rock band too. So you had this conglomeration of bands that varied widely in their influence, but again, you couldn't pin it down anywhere. You couldn't necessarily say all of this is alternative, or all of this is punk, or all of this is new wave, or all of this is, you couldn't do that. It was a weird blending of rock music at the time. And it began to take shape, and the place where it began to take shape the most and get the most airplay was on colleges in the early to mid to even up to the late 80s. But by the time you get to the late 80s, you definitely have the genre established. And by the time you get to 1991, you have the breaking of the genre. Okay, so you have that kind of the staging of it. You have the kind of development, and then you have the establishment of it, and then you have the breaking of it. If you can break the history of this rock movement down into those things. So think of it in terms of that development, establishment, and then breaking out into the mainstream of that establishment. So what kind of bands, what are the earliest bands that we're talking about that influenced it? And then where could we put a point where we say, well, this is alternative rock? This is the first or a number of the first bands that would be considered alternative rock. Let me say, first of all, that I think that one of the people who played significantly into this was David Bowie. And also, I know that as soon as I say something, say a band or talk about a band, there are going to be a number of bands I'm going to leave out. I'm sorry. I don't have all this in my mind. I'm not a computer. This is from what I've seen from documentaries, and then being in contact with people who are in that scene, and also experiencing that scene myself. But I really think a defining feature, a defining moment would be David Bowie. I certainly would say he would be an influence in this genre, because David Bowie was kind of one of the first people to say, I think technically you would say he's classic rock. Technically he would have been on stations that would have played classic rock, but he was far enough out into pop music and some themes of punk music that you couldn't fit him all into classic rock, and also some elements of glam was there, where he did the Iggy Stardust thing and wore the makeup and stuff like that. But I would think that David Bowie would kind of be a foundational, at least a foundational artist who at that time we would consider to be alternative rock. Then I think as you move into the bands that were being played in the early 80s in the college, one band significantly that you would have to take into consideration would be REM. REM was a rock band, but it was very poppy rock. It was very much pop. You could not say REM was pop. You could not say REM was heavy metal at all. You couldn't say it was its own band. It was its own style. It was its own flair. So you would have to say that REM would have been also another foundation, which would later go to actually establish that foundation. That's a little bit more of an evolution from David Bowie. David Bowie still has a significant foot in the classic rock genre, although he's experimenting with other types of rock. You get to 1981 and you have, which I believe was the release of REM's first album. You have this band that was neither pop nor rock, but had elements of both in it. It was a very power pop band, okay? So a very power pop band. Then you also have something like, which also came along during this time, would have been, I would say, The Cure. And let me define that for just a minute. The Cure, like David Bowie, had an established roots. The Cure, as an established band, would have been new wave. That's what they were. They were a new wave band. But they had enough branching out a little bit into some psychedelic music that you couldn't really classify them all under that new wave category, as you could say, for example, Flock of Seagulls. I would say Flock of Seagulls is a complete representation of a new wave band, totally 100%, both feet in the genre. Where, like David Bowie, you've got a significant portion in classic rock, but enough exploration to make him unique and put him outside the classic rock genre. You had the same kind of thing happening with The Cure. You had the basic bottom line of The Cure, the basic, 2 feet planted in The Cure was new wave. But then you had enough of The Cure being involved in psychedelic rock. There were just some elements of psychedelic rock, like Pink Floyd, in their music. It just happened to be that way. And you could say the same about some other bands of that genre. Another band I would say that kind of was foundational along with REM would have been somebody like Joy Division. Joy Division was a new wave band, but it was enough of a punk band that it really didn't fit soundly into either category. You couldn't talk, you listen to Joy Division, and yes, there are elements of punk rock, but it's not totally punk rock. And then you listen to it, and then there are elements of new wave, but it is not new wave. It's enough not new wave to call it not a new wave band, and it's enough of it's not enough of a punk rock band to call it a punk rock band. It was really kind of this interesting blend of the two. So that would have been another foundational band where you can almost stick a pin and start saying, okay, we're getting the rise of alternative rock. Now, another band during that early period, which, okay, I'm going to ruffle some feathers here, but I'm just going to make the claim that this is a band that I would consider to be part of that genre. At least it was played on college radio a lot. And that is U2. The band U2 was certainly one of those bands that I mean, what were they? They were kind of classic rock. They were kind of pop. They were kind of, they didn't fit in anywhere. They didn't quite fit in anywhere. And then you had this explosion again of it being played on college radios, along with bands such as the Talking Heads, who for some reason were kind of considered punk. I mean, they played at the CBGBs, but boy, they were different enough. So you had this development. Then out of that development, out of those early handful of foundational bands, you also had the early, and things go quickly. I mean, we're talking from 81 to 82. I mean, you're talking about bands coming out, defining and changing the genre really super quickly. Sometimes within 6 months, you have this band that comes out that's like, okay, this is a new type of band. The other bands that kind of came out quickly after that would have been bands like the Violent Femmes, Husker Du, and the Pixies. I think the Pixies debuted in '86, as I recall. And if you get to the Pixies and you get to Husker Du, you definitely have alternative rock. The Pixies very influenced by punk rock. The Violent Femmes very influenced by punk rock. But at this point, we are talking about alternative rock. I mean, that's all there is to it. Another band that kind of filters in at this time, these are all these bands that kind of came together. And then the rumbling of this, another band I would say would have been okay, this is, we're getting into alternative rock now, are bands like Faith No More. And Faith No More would have had they had a funk sound, but they had a heavy metal element to them as well. And the Red Hot Chili Peppers, who also a funk rock sound, but a tad bit of a heavy metal sound to it as well. But it wasn't a heavy metal band. The other band that I was thinking of was The Cult. They were kind of a rock band, but they were enough out of like the classic rock and heavy metal genre that they are alternative rock. And then you had the rise of what was called Alternative Nation on MTV, and MTV started playing these bands. Also, that band is skipping my brain right now. Sorry. They had Throwing Copper was their big one, but they had music before that was alternative, that wasn't as popular. I forgot the name of the band. Oh well, that's just the way it is. But you know the band I'm talking about. Throwing Copper was their big debut album. That wasn't their debut album, sorry. It was their big album that was popular after the scene broke, but they had music that went back prior to that. Had music that went back prior to that. So those were kind of the bands. Now, at the same time, you had the Seattle scene growing, and this kind of leads us up to the breaking of it, which I'll get to momentarily. But I want to establish it, and then I want to talk about the breaking of it, and I want to talk about again my personal story and journey with alternative rock. But at the same time, you had all these alternative bands. You also had the Seattle sound that was beginning to develop in the late 80s. 88, 89, even 87. I think 87 is when Nirvana's first album came out, Bleach. It might have been 88. But Melvins were certainly around during that time. And you had the Screaming Trees. Now, they had their own flavor of alternative rock. And again, by alternative rock, I mean it doesn't fit into any other category. However, their flavor of alternative rock, for the most part, was derived on 80s punk bands and heavy metal. It's just what kind of drove that sound. It was a punk meets heavy metal, and even some classic rock sounds to it. if you look at the bands that were around at that time, if you listen to those bands that came out of that Seattle scene that weren't the popular ones now, you're talking about Mudhoney, the Screaming Trees, all bands that got popular as a result of Nirvana breaking the underground. But they're very bluesy. Soundgarden, I think Soundgarden was the first one to sign a major record. They still sounded very bluesy, very almost metal, but again, not quite heavy metal. That was just a big influence on them back then. Not as much pop influence, except for Nirvana had a huge pop influence because Kurt Cobain was heavily influenced by the Beatles, as well as bands like Black Sabbath. So, he always liked to compare his band to Black Sabbath and the Knack. So you had a very poppy kind of sound along with a very heavy metal kind of sound that was unique to Nirvana in that area that I really didn't see replicated by other bands of that time. But you had this big scene, and a lot of times people confuse the two. Unfortunately, it drives me nuts, but people do confuse the two. People automatically think alternative rock means grunge rock, and grunge rock means alternative rock, and that's not the case. Yes, grunge was part of the alternative scene, but it wasn't the only type of music that was coming up and defining that scene. Alternative rock was the bigger umbrella, and you actually had smaller subsets under alternative rock. For example, industrial was a subset under alternative rock, and so was grunge. Grunge was one of the larger ones and one of the more driving forces in why this genre of music exploded, but it certainly wasn't the only type of music that was around, but it was a big influence, and they deserve their credit up there, in the Seattle scene, and they then influenced a lot of other people as a result. Let me just say right up front too that, people say, I tell people all the time, my main focus of rock music is alternative rock. It's my favorite kind of music, from the early days of alternative rock to even some current emanations of alternative rock. I'm not a big grunge fan. I'm not. Even though if you ask me what my favorite band is, I would definitely have to say, if you force me into a corner, there are a few bands who I absolutely love and adore, but if you ask me what my absolute favorite band is, it's Nirvana. It's 100% Nirvana. But Nirvana, yes. So then they'll say well, then you're a grunge fan. I'm not really. I really am not. As a matter of fact, out of the bands that kind of came out of that area, there were, no disrespect, really, no disrespect. We all have our own musical influences and tastes and stuff like that. I didn't like grunge. I wasn't a big Soundgarden fan, although I became more of a Soundgarden fan later on. I did not like Pearl Jam. The only bands really that kind of came out of that area that I really loved were Nirvana, and then the only band that was really grunge sounding was Alice in Chains. I loved Alice in Chains. I still do. And then another band that wasn't popular that I really liked was Mudhoney. But I didn't really care for the Screaming Trees. I didn't really care for even, early emanations of Mother Love Bone. It wasn't my flavor of music. But you had enough of a driving force with Nirvana that it broke the scene. So let's talk a little bit about why this scene broke, and then I'll talk about my personal story from over in hair band to alternative rock. But let me just clarify, Nirvana is technically a grunge band, yes, I understand. But there was enough pop influence in Nirvana that it really separated them, especially Nevermind, and to an extent, Incesticide. There was enough of a pop element to them that really it put them outside of everything else that was going on during that time. Nobody else in that genre of grunge music had as much pop influence as Nirvana did. That's just really all there was to it, and I think that's what made it so catchy and exploded the scene so violently. You know, it just kind of came out of nowhere. It was really Nevermind that did it in 1991. So, as I said, and you might want to listen to the one on the rise and fall of hair metal, which I understand people don't like that term a whole lot, but glam metal, hair metal, whatever. Hair metal was one part of what was considered to be heavy metal, but it was certainly the most exposed part of heavy metal. And by the time you got to the late 80s and early 90s, it had really become a parody of itself. It became a little bit of a joke. Now, I always hate saying this because I know that there are people out there who are super talented, were in those bands, and there are some of those bands that I really loved, and there are some of those bands that I really didn't like at all. But let's just be honest. It was like if I gave you a diet of cotton candy and all you could ever eat was cotton candy, you would get sick of it real quick. The subject matter was very surface level in a lot of these bands, and very macho. Even those bands that look like girls, the idea was macho. You know, the idea was all about how much drugs you could do and how many girls you could score with and all the parties you went to. And it was really about being this big, bright, whatever, you know, I mean, it was really kind of a macho type of thing. Now, with that idea of machoism, the substance of the songs, with a few exceptions, were all about surface level stuff that doesn't really touch the deeper levels of the human experience. And while those things are fun to talk about from time to time, to have a diet of music that is sustained by that is really unsustainable. You just can't sustain it. People got tired of it. They got sick of it. And here comes another group of bands, and leading the way, rightly or wrongly, you know, depending upon your opinion, is Nirvana, who are talking about deeper emotional issues of depression, issues of rejection, issues of drug addiction. It wasn't so much I'm taking drugs to enhance the party. It was more I'm taking drugs to forget all my problems, was the idea. So these deeper emotional issues resounded with Generation X, especially the latter half of Generation X, in a way that the first part of Generation X, that macho me Generation X, kind of didn't have. It didn't experience it, you know. It was more about the internal. It was more about the suffering. It was more about the depression that you were going through. And a lot of people were depressed at that time. And Nirvana comes out with very, not angry to a degree, but more depressed. And I would really say the difference between a punk rock movement and an alternative rock music is punk rock is really more of an angry sound, where alternative rock is more of a depressive sound. And so you had that connection with people. Now, the other thing that connected with people, and I don't know if anybody really has talked about this too much before, but it was the look of grunge, and it was the look of alternative rock people in general. Now, before this, there was a real separation between the audience and the person on stage. In a lot of ways. The person on stage was supposed to be the rock god. And there was also a disconnection in the way they looked as well. And this was true across all forms, not just glam metal, but pretty much all forms of heavy metal that was popular. Whether it's the leather jeans or the makeup or the whatchamacallit, there was this disconnect between the audience, who might be wearing the denim jacket and the concert t-shirt, and the guy on stage who's wearing the spiked leather, wristband and the makeup and the expensive clothes. And there was a real disconnect. Even in some of the better bands of that era, there was that disconnect with the audience. Grunge specifically, and this is where grunge really broke this genre, and Nirvana specifically, didn't have that disconnect from the audience. So there wasn't this emotional disconnect. The emotional disconnect is from previous rock bands is I'm better than you. I'm the best guitarist. I'm the best bass player. I'm the best drummer. And then there was the visual separation. I've got the more expensive clothes. I've got the more expensive car. I've got the more expensive seat. I'm better than you. I'm not that they were trying to say that, but that was the idea. They were the rock gods. You were looking up to them. When Nirvana came out, and then the scene underneath of that, there was less emphasis put on how much better I am, but how much more I connected with you. I connect with you in this way. And they connected on that emotional level. Hey, I'm going through what you're going through, man. If it's a breakup, I'm going through that breakup. I'm struggling with drugs. I'm struggling with depression. Here's my struggles. But in addition to that was the aesthetic connection that this genre had with the audience. And the aesthetic connection was, I look just like you. If you looked at Nirvana, they looked like they just came out of the garage. There wasn't this separation in how they looked from them to the audience. The audience might have been wearing, especially the whole flannel thing. The audience might have been wearing flannel and ripped jeans and a t-shirt that they bought from DI, and so did the people on stage. They were wearing the exact same thing. Now that wasn't intended. It's just that it wasn't so focused on the outside. It wasn't so focused on I'm achieving this lofty rock god goal. It was more about just, well, this is what I woke up in, and this is what I wore around town, and now it's time for the show, and now it's time for us to shoot the video, and I'm just going to wear this really lame striped shirt and this oversized coat that doesn't fit me because that's all I could afford from the DI, and it's cold, and my jeans aren't in the best condition. I'm not wearing leather pants, and I'm not wearing any kind of makeup that would make me look any different from you. So you had this connection with the audience, and I really believe that fed into the explosion of underground music. And I was there for that explosion, and I evolved with it. There was significant overlay in my own personal story between what came before in the heavy metal era, which I talked about in a previous podcast, and the explosion. I had this overlay here. As a matter of fact, in '91, I was as much listening to the band, bands like Jane's Addiction and Faith No More as I was listening to bands like Skid Row and Motley Crue. and that's part of my own personal journey. So I'm trying to cover this up so people don't think I'm product placing. If you're only listening to this, so you don't know, I've got a bottle here that I'm drinking out of, and it's a name brand, but I'm trying to cover it up with my hand so I don't have to get in trouble for paying any royalties or something like that. So my own personal journey through this was, I was a kid who, as a kid of the 80s, and being, I remember I was 15 in 1988. I remember that pretty, and then probably 15 for the majority of 89. And my favorite bands at that time were heavy metal type of bands. And I aspired to be a rock god. You know, I wanted to be lead singer. I wanted to be lead guitarist. I just wanted to be all that stuff. But for me, it was very phony. It was super phony. Now, I hate thinking of the fact that, when alternative rock broke and I jumped on that, that was the phony part of it. No, that was the revealing part of it. That was the Clark Kent coming off and the Superman coming out, so to speak. I was an insecure kid, completely insecure, but I didn't want anybody to know that I was insecure. So I grew my hair out long, and I had a bleach blonde hair. I was trying my best to look like Vince Neil from Motley Crue. I just wanted to be, Vince Neil was my favorite singer at the time. Motley Crue is, at that time, probably Motley Crue is my favorite band. However, I did have an ear for other bands of music, and I did like other bands of music. People would be like, "Oh, you like that? That's kind of weird." I'm like, "Yeah, I do. I really like this." Other bands during that era that I was interested in, which was kind of like the rumblings of my conversion, so to speak, was like the Cult. I loved the Cult. REM to some degree, although I got into REM later, but of course they were popular on the radio and I didn't hate it. And then other, like the Cult, I really liked the Cult when they came out, and when they were popular and being played in rotation on Alternative Nation, and even to some degree on Headbangers Ball. And I was still watching Headbangers Ball at the time. And then other bands were coming, like Jane's Addiction. I really liked Jane's Addiction. Now, there were some bands I got into later, like the Pixies. So Pixies are probably one of my all-time favorite bands now. But other than Nirvana is probably my hands-down favorite band. Don't think that when I say this other band is they're one of my favorites, but top of the line would have to be Nirvana. But Pixies, one of my all-time favorite bands now, but I didn't get into them till after the scene broke, and I started looking at other music. And then growing up kind of in a small town where if you wanted to know about alternative rock or other forms of music, you had to go to the record store or the tape store, and you had to hopefully had somebody there who wasn't just ringing you up and pushing merchandise. They were somebody who was actually into that kind of music and who knew something about music. And fortunately, there were people there that did that. They would tell you, oh, they knew about bands and stuff. So I was able to ask, well, is this a punk band? Is this what kind of band is this? And they'd be able to tell you. So I was into that, but I was into the whole, glam metal, especially, but it was a front. It was I was more of a phony in that area than I was, jumping on the alternative bandwagon. By '92, I had totally jumped on it. People say by '91, the genre broke, and I was there when the genre. I absolutely adored Nirvana when they first came out. I was like, wow, this is crazy. And then by '92, I did the whole wear flannel shirt, wear baggy jeans with long johns underneath them. Instead of having blonde hair, I had it back to my natural color, cut all the cut all the long blonde hair off. As a matter of fact, I had really, really long blonde hair. But for a while there, I just kind of let the natural color grow out of it. And so it was dark underneath. And one day, one evening, I went into a salon shop, and they were about ready to close. And I said, let's just cut this off. Let's cut this blonde hair off. And it was bleach blonde, but the roots were growing out long enough, and I hadn't taken care of it, because I really wanted to look like Vince Neil. And so they cut it off, and it was pretty much dark hair ever since, with the exception of much later, a couple of times where I dyed it green. But that was much later. But then I let that dark hair kind of grow out, and instead of having the heavy metal kind of look. Now, I never had the mullet, but I did have that heavy metal kind of shorter right here. And yeah, a good representation would have been Vince Neil. I really, really, really tried to look like Vince Neil as much as I possibly could. But it wasn't the Joe Elliott, it wasn't that. It was the longer, but instead of that now I wanted it long down in front and long in back. And so I did that. I kind of hopped on that bandwagon pretty quickly. But the reason why I hopped on it pretty quickly was, I shouldn't say quickly, but abruptly. It had been out, but I switched over to it abruptly. And the reason why I switched over to it abruptly was because I connected with it. I mean, that's really all there is to it, is I connected with the internal struggle that these bands were talking about. So at that point in 91, then you have all these other bands that were being established coming out. Of course, you had Smashing Pumpkins, and then bands that were coming out during that time were getting, that maybe like a few years were in it, but were exploding. So bands that I were exposed to during that time were the Pixies, Smashing Pumpkins, who I didn't hear about until Nirvana had come out. The Pixies until Nirvana had come out. And, I forgot. I told this story on one of the other podcasts, but it's worth telling here. One of the things that really kind of switched me over, and it was right shortly before I got that haircut story. Everybody knew at school that I was really into heavy metal. And at the school that I went to, heavy metal people were not popular. There was a few of us. What was really popular was a lot of early alternative, kind of the hippie revival. The Edie Brickell and the New Bohemians. You had a bunch of girls trying to look like her. A lot of new wave people, a lot of diehard Cure fans that were friends of mine. And I was one of those people who actually were kind of intertribal. Like, I looked heavy metal, but I don't know. I just had enough of a magnetic personality that I could go hang out with people who were like into the Cure, and I could go hang out even with people who were into country. I just had that enough of a dynamic to be able to do that. But this one girl gave me a tape, and she said, and I was actually still in high school at the time, so I was 17. So 17 by 18, very transitioning, 19 for sure. But that's really what kind of opened my eyes to this new music that led to this, or one of the things. So let me get to it. I'm sorry, I keep delaying it and making emendations and that. But she gave me a tape, and it was the Violent Femmes. And it was a recorded tape, so it was a bootleg tape. And she just gave it to me. She says, you know what? I think you'd really like this. Because I was really into music, and I would talk about music all the time. So she said, I think you'd really like this. And she gave me this Violent Femmes. And I just absolutely adored it. I mean, I thought it was the cat's meow. I listened to that tape so many times, loved it, ordered it, the real copy of it myself, the Violent Femmes, their first one, with Glister in the Sun and all that stuff. I mean, I just absolutely loved that album. Blister in the Sun, sorry, I'm forgetting it now. But I love that. And that was one of the things that started the ball rolling into my experience with alternative rock music. So I started getting into that and then was well established into that. Now, let's talk in closing about the decline of alternative rock. Alternative rock is still around. It changed to some degree into screamo and emo. I'm going to be wrapping up here soon because I don't want to, this could be another podcast on its own. But it did as well burn itself out, because just like a diet of cotton candy can't sustain you, neither can a diet of depression. And you had, Kurt Cobain's death in '94. You had the breakup of Soundgarden in '96. And then you had these other bands that were kind of carrying on. A lot of the bands out of the Seattle scene, the singers have all died. And then you started getting all the copycat bands, all the copycat grunge bands, and all the copycat alternative rock bands. And it didn't sustain itself. And then you had the backlash. And one of the backlash of it were people coming out and saying, I am absolutely, totally sick of this heroin rock. And that's what a lot of what it was called was heroin rock. And I am going to play, like Smash Mouth. And you had, they weren't like heavy metal, but they were like, we are not part of this gloomy rock. You had Kid Rock kind of come out at the time, and then you had bands that were trying to fuse rap and metal together, and it just kind of took over. It was a new group of kids coming up, and when you're 15 years old, and Nirvana now is a kind of an older band. Their heyday was years before you were 15, and now the band that's coming out is 311 and Puddle of Mud and bands like that, Smash Mouth. That's what these 15-year-olds are going to listen to. And then they're growing up and they're taking over the industry. And it really kind of went out because people got sick of it. Unfortunately, people kind of got sick of it quickly. But let me tell you, let me give you this. There was sustaining power in that type of music that wasn't in the previous music of heavy metal. Let me give you an example. If I see somebody wearing a Nirvana shirt, I can see people of all ages still wearing a Nirvana shirt. Or even a The Doors shirt or something like that. There was some sustaining power to that. Like, I see kids today still wearing Nirvana shirts because it speaks to them. If you see somebody wearing a Winger shirt or or a Motley Crue shirt or a Poison shirt, they're normally people who are in their 50s and it's nostalgia driven. That industry today is nostalgia driven, whereas Nirvana today is still very much part of the influence on society, the influence on the culture, and an influence in rock music. Now, of course, I'm going to bring this to a close. I've been blathering on here for 50 minutes or so. So there's a lot I could say about the death of this type of music, but this gets us into the late 90s and 2000s and then some of its survivors. But that's going to have to be for another show. So I just want to say thank you for listening. And as I always say, again, there are so many bands I could have mentioned and so many influences. If there's a band you think I should have mentioned or a subject matter you think I should have mentioned, please leave it in the comment section below. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share this on your favorite social media. If you're listening to this on the podcast format, leave me an honest review, leave me an honest rating. It would mean a lot to me. And until then, I'm Ian C., and this has been Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. We'll talk to you again real soon.